For 7 long months, they'd been staring out to sea, watching and waiting. They knew the Allies were coming, knew that the British, Americans, Canadians were preparing a massive army that was coming to attack them, the hated German occupiers. But they didn't know when the Allies were coming, and they didn't know where they would land. And there's one other thing those Germans didn't know, that while they were watching the sea, others were watching them. This is a documentary called D-Day, The Soldier's Story, about the young, terrified conscripts going ashore on the 6th of June 1944. My name's Giles Milton, and I've come to West Wales, to Morfa Buchan, to see the replica of the Atlantic Wall built by the D-Day planners, to see how they were going to breach this system of fortifications that Hitler had built all along the Normandy coastline. We'll be going through the training that these men underwent, the practices they did at storming the beaches of Normandy. We'll be speaking about the voyage across the English Channel. We'll be meeting young commandos like Cliff Morris, who wrote a vivid diary about his experiences on the 6th of June. And of course, we'll be following the men up the beaches of Normandy under heavy and sustained German machine gun fire as they sought to breach Hitler's Atlantic Wall and liberate Nazi-occupied Europe. This is a story that hasn't been told before. We know the accounts of the generals and the senior officers, but we've never before heard the voices of the terrified young men, many of them 17, 18 years old, who are the ones who are going to be trying to liberate Europe from the Nazi yoke. Bayeux. It's a bustling little market town just 3 miles from the Normandy coast. It's famous, of course, for its Bayeux tapestry, which tells the story of William the Conqueror's fleet of ships crossing the English Channel. The story of heavily armed soldiers preparing for battle, of young men in fear of what they're about to face. Fighting on beaches has always been a terrifying experience. Terrifying in 1066 and terrifying in 1944. Throughout this show, we'll be visiting the key landmarks across Normandy to see the remains of the coastal defences that the German soldiers had to hold and that the Allies had to overcome. This is all that's left of German strongpoint 62, one of a string of massive fortifications that stretched the entire length of Omaha Beach. It was equipped with mortars, with big guns, with machine guns, all of which were pointing directly towards the beach, awaiting the arrival of the Allied forces. 80 years ago, in that fateful year, Bayeux is home to this man here, Guillaume Mercader. He's a young man back then, handsome and as French as the Eiffel Tower. He's also a champion cyclist who's won a ton of racing medals. He's something of a hero in his native Bayeux. And that young Guillaume Mercader, he's got another key talent. He's a charmer, a real charmer, and so persuasive that he's convinced the head of the local Gestapo to allow him to continue his cycle training along the Normandy coastal road, a road that's a forbidden zone to all the locals who live nearby. There's a good reason why the road's out of bounds to that local French population. It's the main point of access for all the defences of the Atlantic Wall, the string of fortifications the Germans have built along this entire stretch of coastline. The German soldiers stationed here had no idea, as they watched Guillaume Mercader cycling up and down the coastal road, that he was noting down every bunker, pillbox and machine gun nest, noting down troop movements and minefields and beach defences. They had no idea that Guillaume Mercader was a spy and was working for the Allies. Guillaume Mercader always had his ID with him, and he always had his permit from the Gestapo just in case he was stopped and questioned. But tucked into his vest and cycle pants was a stash of notes and drawings and diagrams that would have got him tortured and executed if discovered. For fully 3 years, Guillaume Mercader had been gathering intelligence on the German coastal defences. He was a key member of the French resistance, whose local branch was passing vital information to the Allies. Within a day or two of Guillaume Mercader cycling along that Normandy coast road, the latest intelligence he'd gathered would be handed to General Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander and the man in overall charge of D-Day. On Friday the 2nd of June 1944, Guillaume Mercader had a secret meeting with the head of the local French resistance, a man named Robert Deslandes. Deslandes told him some sensational news. The débarquement, he said, D-Day, was to be launched within days, and it was to be on a truly massive scale. Robert Deslandes' news was correct. D-Day was indeed imminent, and it was to be the biggest seaborne invasion in history. It would involve 7,000 ships and landing craft, 11,000 planes, and 15,000 airborne troops. Every evening, the BBC broadcast hundreds of personal messages to France, messages that were coded instructions for the resistance. Now, at that meeting with Robert Deslandes, Guillaume Mercader learned that the exact date and time of the D-Day landings were to be broadcast in similar fashion, with each branch of the resistance receiving its own coded instructions. One of those messages would be for Mercader and his team, and it would be broadcast just a few days before D-Day, at precisely 6:30 p.m. When they heard the phrase "Il fait chaud à Suez," it's hot in Suez, followed by "Les dés sont jetés," the dice are thrown, it meant the Allied landings were imminent. As soon as they heard these two phrases, Mercader and his fellow resistors were to start cutting communication cables in the area around Bayeux. This would cause havoc for the German defenders. By the spring of 1944, D-Day had been in the planning for more than a year. 5 beaches in Normandy had been selected for the landings. Their code names were Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno and Sword. Sword and Gold were assigned to the British, Juno to the Canadians, and Utah and Omaha to the Americans. This beach of Morvebucken in West Wales was where thousands of American troops trained, mainly for storming the beach at Omaha, one of the 5 beaches in Normandy. They learned every possible skill on this beach. They learned to come ashore in amphibious vehicles. They learned how to come off their landing craft, how to climb up this beach under heavy and sustained live gunfire. Some of the exercises that took place here and on similar beaches involved tens of thousands of men. 2 years earlier, in 1942, Hitler had issued Führer Directive No. 40, ordering the building of massive defences along the coast of France, Belgium, the Netherlands, defences that extended for fully 1,500 miles, right up to the northern tip of Norway.
But Hitler can't believe his own propaganda. The Nazis know the invasion is coming. Why else are they so desperately arming the fortress? Gathered from all the arsenals of Europe, the factories of Krupp, the foundries of Skoda in Czechoslovakia, of Schneider-Crusoe in France, all converging on the old towns of the French seacoast.
Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Wüstenfuchs or Desert Fox, a brilliant tank commander, highly decorated and celebrated for his battles in the sun-baked deserts of North Africa. Now, in 1944, he's the man in charge of the Atlantic Wall, and he's also in charge of German Army Group B. His job is to defend the French coastline against the expected Allied landings. When Rommel inspected the Atlantic Wall in January 1944, he found it was not all it was cracked up to be. There were gaps which could easily be exploited by a well-trained attacker. So he set to work, turning that Atlantic Wall into an impregnable barrier. He ordered the construction of concrete and steel tank defences, had millions of mines laid in both the sea and on land, and flooded all the fields and meadows just behind the beaches. He also ordered thousands of long wooden poles to be stuck upright into the sandy beaches. Known as Rommel's asparagus, these were topped with mines that would be submerged at high tide. Any landing craft heading towards the beach would hit the mines and be blown sky high. And those wooden poles, they were not just on the beaches. They were in fields, meadows and open spaces, anywhere that a glider might land, bringing in extra troops. To learn more, I've come to speak with Mark Worthington, who served in a latter incarnation of the British 6th Airborne Division, and who's now in charge of the Pegasus Bridge Memorial Museum.
So behind me is the eastern flank of the D-Day coast, and this is where the 6th Airborne Division, British division of course, took up position on the morning of the 6th of June. And they had to clear the landing poles the Germans had put in the fields, called Rommel's asparagus. And they were vertical poles, they were tree trunks, and they had to come down before the glider-borne troops came in later on the morning of the 6th of June. The poles had been put in the ground. The Germans didn't do this, the French had to do it. The Germans supervised, but the French had to do the work. Nothing behind me has changed in 79 years. It is exactly as it was in 1944. Even the power lines running over the fields were there when the British flew in.
General Dwight Eisenhower knows all this. He's getting real-time intelligence from Guillaume Mercader, remember? And he has to make a key decision, one that will affect everything that follows. Should his troops land at high tide or low tide? There was a reason why the Allied forces landed here at low tide. In 1944, this beach was awash with mines and anti-tank obstacles, and the idea was that the American forces could see those obstacles and avoid them. The downside, of course, was they had to run the gauntlet of this entire beach under heavy machine gun fire and mortar fire. Eisenhower chose the low tide option. He hoped a massive Allied bombardment from sea and air would silence the Germans' coastal guns. But it was a gamble, and he knew it. If the naval guns faltered, if the planes missed their targets, if something went wrong, then thousands of young men would find themselves on the beaches, exposed and vulnerable, and in grave danger of being killed. It gave Eisenhower sleepless nights. He chain-smoked around the clock, because if he'd chosen the wrong option, then D-Day would fail, and that would be the end of everything. There could be no second D-Day. May 1944. The weather's turned warm. There's glorious spring sunshine. And for more than 3 weeks, British Commando Cliff Morris and his mates have been betting on when they'd be heading to France. Morris himself thought their moment had come on Saturday the 20th of May, when he and his comrades in 6th Commando were ordered into their landing craft. That very day, along with thousands of others, they set off across the English Channel. A great pitch of excitement, wrote Cliff in his diary. Not only were we carrying full-scale ammo, equipment and rations, but the rest of the convoy was loaded up with tanks, guns and infantry. This was surely it. But just 16 miles from France, they came to a dramatic halt, performed a U-turn, and retraced their steps back to the south coast of England. They would eventually wade ashore at Lancing Beach near Brighton. It was another exercise, another practice run, one of dozens they'd already undertaken. Commando Cliff was not happy, as he wearily admitted to his diary. This was followed by a 10-mile march inland onto the Downs, where we had to dig in. It was a long and exhausting night. I've come to King's College London to see one of the most remarkable original records from D-Day. This is the original handwritten diary by a commando called Cliff Morris, who was under the command of Lord Lovett. And his task on D-Day was to land on Sword Beach, knock out as many pillboxes and German bunkers as he could, and then advance inland towards Pegasus Bridge to meet up with the men who'd captured that bridge during the night. There are some extraordinary moments in this diary, and for me, one of the most bizarre is when Cliff Morris's commanding officer, having seen the men vomiting all night long, instructs them to wash, shave, and polish their boots because he says, "We want you going ashore looking spick and span." It's very British. The commanding officer of the commandos was Lord Lovett, and his mantra was, "He who hesitates is lost." Speed was to be everything on that morning. By early June, Cliff Morris and his comrades were among the best trained troops for D-Day. Led by this flamboyant Scottish aristocrat, they'd been trained to within a whisker of their lives. They'd studied how to assault heavily defended beaches while under live fire. Their drivers had been trained to drive through deep seawater. Their medical staff had been taught how to recover wounded soldiers during the battle. Physical fitness was essential, for they were told they'd be covering huge distances. Weapons, equipment, heavy packs, everything had to be carried. Over the previous months, Cliff Morris and his men had done scores of endurance marches and dozens of simulated landings, both in daytime and at night. Some of the toughest training took place at Inveraray in Scotland, gateway to the Highlands. Here, there were specialist courses for infantry, artillery, and engineers. Here, commandos like Cliff Morris were pushed to the very brink. And for those who had completed their training, there would soon be large-scale battle exercises involving thousands of men. For the architects of D-Day, this beach at Morfa in West Wales was the perfect place for training the men. At low tide, it had a huge expanse of sand, and this had been studded with so-called dragon's teeth, which are anti-tank defences. There was a huge bank of shingle, just as there was in Normandy, and they'd also constructed a replica of Hitler's Atlantic Wall, this formidable concrete defence that the men would have to get through. And behind the beach, there were the bluffs and cliffs that the men tackling Omaha Beach in Normandy would have to scale. It was the perfect place for the men to train. Some of the exercises that took place here and on similar beaches involved tens of thousands of men. And inevitably, in some of these exercises, there were casualties. In fact, in one notorious incident, Exercise Tiger, some 946 American servicemen were killed. The landing craft out at sea were attacked unexpectedly by German torpedo boats, and when the men came ashore under live gunfire, many of them were killed. It was an absolute disaster and a tragedy, and had to be covered up by General Eisenhower and his senior commanders. No one could know that so many men had lost their lives. Indeed, those men, those 946 men, more men were lost on that exercise than would actually lose their lives storming the beach of Utah on D-Day itself. Despite the terrible setback, the training was intense for a good reason. A complicated series of objectives needed to be carried out on D-Day, and the men had to be well prepared. A key objective in the night before the beach landings was to capture two vital bridges, at Benneville and at Ranville. If these bridges could be seized and held, it would prevent German reinforcements from heading towards the coastline. And this in turn would stop them from counterattacking the newly landed Allied troops. Possession of those two bridges would also enable Allied troops to advance rapidly out of their beachhead.
And they separated the eastern flank of the D-Day coast, where the airborne troops had landed, and the D-Day beaches. There were two bridges across the waterways, and they had to be taken intact, quickly, and by surprise. And so the British airborne forces used glider-borne troops to take the two bridges, because the troops could be brought down in one place at one time, and of course when the gliders flew in there was no noise. So the Germans didn't know the Allies were coming, so they didn't have time to blow the bridges up. This is what the Allies were concerned about.
Two of the airborne troops assigned to this coup de main bridge operation were Wally Parr and Charlie Gardner. They'd been knocked into shape by their commander, John Howard, a 32-year-old Oxfordshire policeman. He'd devised his own grueling physical fitness programme. He'd forced his men to trudge 30 miles through bogland, slither across firing ranges with live bullets skimming their heads. In the previous winter, they'd been dumped on Salisbury Plain and told to find their own way back to base. Wally Parr collapsed on several occasions. Here he is talking about one of those enforced marches. Your feet are raw and you've got blisters and blood everywhere, and your back's aching, and you're spending night after night on Salisbury Plain, sleeping on the frozen ground.
John Howard was chosen amongst many other officers because he was a brilliant trainer. He could train the men very well. He wasn't very popular, but the men respected him and respected his abilities, and he wouldn't ask the men to do something he wasn't prepared to do himself. Now, the training was carried out for the capture of the bridges near Exeter in the west of the United Kingdom. And rather than jump out of gliders, the men arrived in trucks and jumped out of trucks, and they trained and trained and trained for this. And then they were making their way back to Bulford, which is about 120 odd miles. And they were getting in the trucks, and Howard said they were walking back. So they had to walk back with full kit, 120 miles back to the base. So they didn't particularly like him, but they were well trained, the soldiers, due to John Howard's command.
By the first week of June, the troops were as ready as they would ever be. There was but one problem: the dreadful British weather. Summer never arrived that year. Every day seemed to be worse than the one before. There was wind, rain, cold, and more wind. It was impossible for D-Day to take place with the seas so rough and stormy. "A real blow for us," wrote Cliff Morris in his diary on Sunday the 4th of June. "It dashed our hopes to the ground, and we slept very little that night." Behind the scenes, there was growing panic. At Supreme Allied Headquarters, General Eisenhower was about to make the most difficult decision of his life: when to launch D-Day. If he got it wrong, and the weather worsened, the entire invasion would fail. Eisenhower's principal weatherman, James Stagg, was pessimistic about a break in the weather. Not only was it wet and stormy, but there was thick cloud cover over the French coast. "Just name us 5 fine, calm days and we'll go for it," said General Eisenhower. It sounded so easy, but it proved so difficult. When he studied his charts, he noticed the beginnings of a large cold front sweeping eastwards across the Atlantic. If those charts were correct, this would bring clear skies and calmer seas for Tuesday, the 6th of June. He told this to General Eisenhower, and shortly before dawn, on Monday, the 5th of June, Eisenhower gave D-Day the green light. "Okay," he said, "we'll go." General Eisenhower was not alone in being troubled by the weather. The German weathermen were also trying to predict an end to the stormy seas. The weather was as crucial to their defences as it was to the Allied attackers. The Luftwaffe's weatherman, Walter Stuber, was assembling data from his pilots. They convinced him there was little chance of a change in the bad weather. On Sunday the 4th of June, shortly before General Eisenhower gave D-Day the green light, weatherman Stuber told his senior staff officers there was no chance of an imminent Allied invasion. "The weather situation," he said, "is becoming worse." Those 6 words were to prove fateful for the German forces defending the coastline of Normandy. In fact, they were to prove disastrous. Franz Gockel, a German teenage conscript in Normandy, wide-eyed, innocent, and homesick. He's 18 but doesn't look more than 15, and he's never felt comfortable in his baggy, crumpled uniform. Franz Gockel was one of thousands of German conscripts who'd been posted to Normandy in the previous October 1943. Now, he's one of a small team in charge of Strongpoint 62, a concrete bunker with 6-foot thick walls and a massive gun pointing out to sea. It's part of the elaborate system of defences that extend right along this stretch of Normandy coastline. This is all that's left of the machine gun nest belonging to German strongpoint WN62, part of a massive string of defences all along this stretch of coastline. This machine gun nest was the home of a young conscript, German conscript, called Franz Gockel, who spent his days in this place, looking out to the horizon, waiting for the expected Allied fleet to arrive. Gockel and his comrades know this stretch of beach by its local name, Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer. They're unaware that the Americans have given it a code name. To them, it's Omaha, and they're intending to land 34,000 troops here on D-Day. If Gockel is to avoid death or capture, he'll have to stop them with that state-of-the-art, water-cooled machine gun. Gockel's very different from Hitler's goose-stepping professional soldiers, the ones you see on every wartime movie. And he's very different from the battle-hardened panzer commanders who've spent the last 3 years fighting on the Eastern Front. He's a schoolboy, never fired a gun in anger, and he's feeling homesick that spring. He writes dozens of letters to his beloved Mutti, telling his mother as much as the censors will allow him to say. Everything feels spring-like, he writes in one of those letters. But at 8,000 or 9,000 meters, observer planes circle overhead, leaving white condensation trails behind them. Gockel knows that they're Allied planes, spy planes, taking reconnaissance photos of the German coastal defences. He also knows that the Allies are coming soon. D-Day's not a secret, everyone's talking about it. But no one on the German side knows when or where they'll attack.
A few of the many cameramen ready to cover D-Day. These Navy men will bring you pictures of this historical invasion. Of these war cameramen, we can only show you a few, but these are some of the men who will risk their lives to shoot this gigantic military venture.
Gockel is a German, born and bred, but many of those defending the coastal strongpoints are not. Lots of them are ethnic Germans from occupied Poland, unwilling conscripts. And there are other nationalities too, Tatars, Georgians. They're not fighting with the Nazis because they like Hitler. They're fighting because they hate Stalin. Gockel can't help wondering about the loyalty of these so-called Ostbataillon. Will they really fight when the Allies' long-expected invasion comes? Or will they throw down their weapons and give themselves up? 4 months earlier, in January 1944, the German commander, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, had visited the very defences manned by Franz Gockel and his comrades. It was part of his inspection tour of the Atlantic Wall. He was not impressed. While the strong points were well fortified, the beach itself had very few defences. Rommel issued an order to Gockel and his comrades. This bay must be protected as fast as possible against any type of landing by the Allies. He was convinced the Americans and Brits would land on this very beach right here because it was exactly the same as the beaches where they'd landed in Italy. In the aftermath of Rommel's visit, Gockel and the other lads set to work strengthening those beach defences. By June, they're almost finished. Low tide or high tide, the beach is going to be a death trap to anyone landing here. And this was where a young Franz Gockel sat day in, day out, waiting for the Allied fleet to arrive. And his job, when they get into sight, is to start gunning them down with his machine gun. Gockel grows increasingly nervous that spring. He sees hundreds of English bombers flying overhead, almost every day. They're bombing bridges and railways inland, which can only mean one thing. The Allies are destroying the local transport system to stop German reinforcements reaching the coast. One day, Gockel finds thin strips of aluminium on the ground. they're everywhere, in the fields, the trees, the hedges. He's told it's been dropped by the Allied planes in order to confuse German radar. And it works. The radar's no longer as efficient as it used to be. And then one day, Sämtlicher Urlaub wird storniert. All leave is cancelled. It's a worrying new development. It suggests the landings will be coming any day soon. Life that May grew increasingly tense, but it was also tedious. Gockel's team consisted of just 24 men, and he, Gockel, spent most days staring blankly out to sea. May becomes June, almost summer, but the weather suddenly turns cloudy on Friday the 2nd of June. By Saturday the 3rd, it's tipping down. Summer in Normandy, cold, wet and miserable. By Sunday the 4th of June, the weather's got even worse. It's raining and blowing a gale, and the channel is unbelievably rough. It's so rough, in fact, that Field Marshal Rommel decides to make a visit to Germany. It's his wife's birthday, and he's bought her some chic Parisian suede shoes as a present. He leaves Normandy that very night, the 4th of June, having convinced himself that the Allied invasion is impossible in such weather. Rommel's not alone in assuming the Allies won't be coming in the near future. General Erich Marx, distinguished commander of the German 84th Corps, has also concluded that the weather's too bad for any Allied invasion. He starts planning his 53rd birthday party for the following night, Monday the 5th of June. He's even requisitioned a few bottles of vintage Chablis. It's a similar story at the other command posts. In fact, most of the divisional coastal commanders are making their way to the city of Rennes, where they're due to take part in a war games exercise. Not one of them will be at their posts on the 5th and 6th of June. It's the evening of Monday the 5th of June. Franz Gockel's on machine gun duty once again, staring blankly out to sea. The wind's increased in strength and the channel's stormier than ever. There's no way, thinks Gockel, the invasion will be coming tonight. He finishes his shift around midnight and makes his way back to the main bunker. Some of his comrades are playing cards, others are listening to music on the old wind-up gramophone. They've only got a few records and they know all the songs off by heart. Soon, Gockel heads to his bunk. He'll be sleeping in his uniform as ever because he and his comrades are not allowed to get undressed, just in case. Gockel finds such a rule ridiculous, especially on a night like this. The rain's lashing down, the wind's blowing a gale. There's no way the Allies will be coming tonight. Gockel turns over in his bunk, sighs, and falls into a deep slumber. One of the very first people to learn that the Allied landings were underway was a young German conscript named Eva Eifler. She worked in Luftwaffe communications, and her job was to gather information being sent in by observation posts up and down the Normandy coastline. At about midnight on the 5th of June, she began to receive messages that Allied paratroopers were landing all along that stretch of coast. So she was one of the very first people to learn that Invasionstag, or D-Day, was at long last underway. Eva was a very unwilling conscript. She was a schoolgirl. She'd been drafted into Luftwaffe communications, forced to study Morse code and how to transmit messages, transcribe coded messages coming in from observation posts all along the stretch of coastline. But it placed her in a unique and very important position because she would become the first person to learn that the landings were finally underway. But on that particular night, Monday the 5th of June, everything looked set to be quiet. The sky was filled with storm clouds, meaning there'd be very little air activity. Fraulein Eifler was hoping to get some rest. There she was, seated at her desk with headphones clamped to her ears. It was some time before she received the first messages from field stations across Normandy. To her ears, they always sounded like gibberish. ACXL50W, and there were others too, always a jumble of letters and numbers. Not until they'd been transcribed would the meaning become clear. And on that particular night, at around midnight, those coded messages revealed something sensational. Allied paratroopers were landing in Normandy. It was the beginning of D-Day. I've come to Pegasus Bridge, site of the most audacious mission to take place on D-Day.
Well, there were several Germans on each bridge at night. This was a routine job for the German troops, so they weren't particularly motivated. And so there were 2 Germans on this bridge, a couple on the other bridge that night. Most of the Germans would go off in the evenings and sleep in the bunker next to the bridge. And in June, the weather wasn't too good on the night of the 5th, 6th of June, so there were just 2 Germans on this bridge when the British arrived. There were machine gun positions around the bridges also, but they weren't manned immediately when the British landed.
The men had trained for months. They were at the peak of their physical fitness, and they were excited. The adrenaline was pumping through their veins, but they were also nervous, frightened. There was every chance they'd be dead by the morning. Their mission depended upon stealth and silence. They were to land in gliders close to the 2 bridges, then storm them with overwhelming force. If they were successful, they'd then have to hold them for at least 12 hours until reinforced by soldiers marching inland from the beaches. There were major hurdles to be overcome. First and foremost was the difficulty of landing a glider on target, especially at night.
The Horsa glider could carry 28 men maximum. As you can see, the space for maybe 50 men. But the space wasn't the problem, it was the weight. And 28 was the absolute maximum with their equipment. Some of them were carrying 90 pounds, which is about 45 kilos. So 28 men, or a jeep and a trailer. In the trailer there could be ammunition, medical supplies, radio equipment, food, or a jeep and a gun called a 6-pounder. They couldn't drive them in, the turn was too sharp, and the men had to bounce them around the corner to get them in, and they had to bounce the guns, slide the guns in, which weighed 2 tons, to get them in. So the front of the jeep was facing towards the back of the plane. If there was a gun, the muzzle was in the cockpit. The pilots had to climb over the barrel to sit down. And they've told me, the pilots, they didn't mind 20-odd men behind them. They didn't like 3 tons of steel, because if it broke loose, and sadly it did on occasions, they knew which way it was going. So the jeeps would come out the back of the plane. Now, looking down the fuselage, you can see there are 2 seats at the back, an open door. Well, around the structure, around the bulkhead at that point, there were bolts in sockets with split pins. And once the plane had landed, the men would pull the pins, slide the bolts, and the tail would drop away so they could unload from the back. But can you imagine one of these landing at about 60, 70 miles per hour in a rough field? Occasionally, the fuselage could twist slightly. And if it twisted where the sockets were, of course, they were no longer aligned, and the troops couldn't get the bolts off. So to be absolutely sure they'd come off, technicians from the Air Force placed explosive charges on the bolts. So the men were in these things, blowing the charges, if they could, before the glider had stopped.
There was also the Rommel's asparagus to consider, those sharpened poles that were in virtually every field in Normandy. If a glider hit them, its wings would be ripped off. This bridge operation was not for the faint-hearted. It was dangerous and possibly fatal. "OK, chaps," said John Howard as his men boarded the gliders. "Speed is essential. We've got to take these bridges and we've got to hold them. See you there, lads. Don't be late." Some of the men had gallows humour. "If they lined the glider with silk," said one, "the thing would be ideal to bury the lot of us in." The gliders used Halifax tow planes to get them airborne. Then, once they'd crossed the English Channel, there was a loud twang as the glider detached itself from the Halifax. They were now alone, gliding towards Earth. No engines, only the wind and the skill of the pilots.
Yeah, they took off from England on the evening of the 5th of June. Took 69 minutes to fly over the channel. So at 9 minutes past midnight, the glider pilots released the tow cables from the tug aircraft well off the coast, which enabled the tug aircraft to turn and fly away, so the Germans hadn't heard the engine noise. Now, the gliders landing next to the Orne Bridge landed north of the bridge, and they dived straight in and landed in the field, one of them coming in at almost 200 miles per hour. It was released far too high, and the pilot had to dive in to avoid overshooting the bridge. And he told me he hit the ground at about 200 miles per hour, which is about the landing speed of an airliner. The gliders landing next to this bridge had to go much further, and they landed south of the bridge. So they went further south, turned, and flew in from the south using their stopwatch and compass. And the gliders landed, the three of them landed within 80 yards of the bridge, 80 meters. But number one, 47 meters, 47 yards from the bridge. And the commander of the Air Force for D-Day, Lee Mallory, said it was one of the most outstanding feats of precision flying of the entire Second World War. And within 10 minutes, both bridges were captured intact.
"Come out and fight, you square-headed bastards!" shouted Wally Parr as he and Charlie Gardner chucked explosives into the German dugouts that surrounded the bridge. Over the minutes that followed, the Germans, now wide awake, came out fighting. Grenades, machine guns, Sten guns, the bridge was buzzing with gunfire. One of John Howard's men, Den Brotheridge, took a bullet through the neck and collapsed to the ground. He would be the first fatality on D-Day. Others were wounded by flying shrapnel, but it soon became clear that John Howard's men had the upper hand. And what of the Germans? Private Helmut Römer was an 18-year-old conscript on sentry duty that night. He'd heard the crash landing of the gliders, but didn't bother to investigate. Only when the gunfire started did he realise he was in trouble. Private Römer had no intention of fighting. He and two others leapt off the bridge and hid in an elderberry bush. Wally Parr was sniffing at victory. The battle had begun to turn. He ran across the bridge towards the nearby Café Gondry and peered through the iron grating. He could see Madame Gondry and her two terrified daughters crouching in the cellar. Parr pushed a chocolate bar through the grate. "The first two children to be liberated in the invasion of Europe," he would later say, "liberated by a Cockney with a bar of chocolate." Benneville, or Pegasus Bridge, was now captured. And a similar success story had unfolded at Ranville Bridge, which had also been captured from the Germans. Now, the wireless operator, Colonel Tappenden, sent the agreed signal to England. Ham and jam, ham and jam. It meant the operation had been a success. The German counterattack came within the hour. John Howard's men heard the clanking of tanks as the Germans brought up their heavy armour. But they were waiting with a Piat anti-tank gun in hand. To fire this gun, you had to pull this thing back here with a coiled spring inside, and then you placed this inside here, you took an aim at what you wanted to knock out, and you fire. And if you got it right, you're going to knock out a jeep, a small vehicle, even a small tank. This proved crucial on the morning of the 6th of June, because the guys who'd taken and were holding Pegasus Bridge, they managed to knock out a German self-propelled gun that was coming towards the bridge. There was a massive explosion, and when the other Germans saw that, they turned and fled. So this gun here helped save the operation at Pegasus Bridge. The first shot knocked out the leading armoured vehicle, and it exploded in a ball of fire. The other tanks promptly turned and fled. The best news came in the early hours, when the men heard the loud drone of hundreds of airplanes. Then, like a miracle before their eyes, the sky was filled with parachutes. It was the first of the 7,000 troops of the 6th Airborne Division due to land over the coming hours. John Howard could hardly believe what he was seeing. "One of the most awe-inspiring sights of my life," he said. But he also knew that he and his men faced the struggle of their lives over the coming hours. It was essential for them to hold the two bridges until they were relieved by the commandos, due to land on Sword Beach that very morning. They faced a tense and troubling time as they waited, hoped, and prayed. The night had never seemed so long, but the day ahead was to prove even longer. In episode 2, we'll follow the remarkable stories of the men and women who took part in the largest seaborne invasion in history.